This article, in which we wrote together with my colleague Nicolas Blarel from Leiden University, looks at the role of substate organizations as agents in foreign policy. And we started off this project because both of us have been examining Indian foreign policy from various angles, and we found that the grand theories of IR, as we understand it, don't really explain the amount of agency that these substate organizations cost from time to time in many of these spaces. And that's how we came to working together on this project, that the role of substate organizations driving foreign policy in ways that the foreign ministries are actually deferring to these substate organizations for guidance, because these sectors are hyper specialized, like defense, like nuclear programs, like space programs. Nicolas' own work, which he can speak to better than I, his expertise in India, Israel, and my own interest and research that I've done in the past on France and India just brought us together to write this project. And
yeah. Well, thank you, Jay, for introducing a little bit what the puzzle that we were interested in. And I mean, some of these, somewhat Jayita was already talking about on, you know, the deference to specific agencies from the what we call the foreign policy executive, often in foreign policy analysis, is not completely new to scholars working on FPA, on foreign policy analysis. I mean, there's a lot of literature on organizations. You know, if you look at Allison's early work or Alperin, about deference and organizations having maybe some leverage in foreign policy implementation because they're specialized agencies. Now, where we differ a little bit from that existing literature is that it's mostly a lot of these, a lot of discussion about organizational process and processes is basically building on the US experience, and it's mostly about the influence of organizations in the decision-making process leading to particular decisions like Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. What we were more interested in about to focus on basically is how these organizations actually have maybe their own foreign policies, right? Not just how they kind of influence and shape what the FPE, the foreign policy executives, want as a mission. So what we were interested notably on is these transnational partnership, or maybe these international partnerships in the field, specialized fields that Jayita was talking about, you know, space cooperation, nuclear program development, or defense cooperation, very niche fields, very important. You would think the FPE, the foreign policy executive, would try to control these important national security kind of very sensitive technology fields, but we noticed in some of the cases we were talking about with India's partnerships with France or Israel that there's actually a lot of influence agency from the foreign policy, from these subnational organizations, what we call the SSOs. So what we try to do is build a little bit on Allison's earlier work, but we also built on other work on basically cross-national, cross-organizational cooperation in the private sector. There's a little bit of literature on this, and institutional isomorphism, where there's also literature explaining why, you know, similar organizations that are designed in which have similar institutional designs, basically similar organizational cultures, standard operating procedures, etc. Try to, you know, that facilitates kind of inter-organizational learning and cooperation. So they basically select their partners based on these factors, on these processes. So there's basically what we wanted to explain when we look at our cases was not just was first identifying the conditions under which, you know, these substate organizations are actually have more leverage on foreign policy making and selecting particular partners, but also how the preferences and the procedures of these substate organizations actually affect the selection of these international partnerships, right? So it's both the conditions under which these SSOs, substate organizations, have more leverage, but also how also they select their partners. So it's this two-stage kind of causal process that we were interested in. And there we built on these scholarships on private and public organizations, and we identified a series of hypotheses that the more technical the nature of the foreign policy issue, the more, the foreign policy executive defers to these kind of SSOs. So that's one way these organizations come in. They have the requisite specialized expertise, and they can influence the policy or the future policy proposals from the FPE. Then, sometimes the FPEs also provide some very broad policy objectives, and then, these state organizations have a greater discretion maybe in determining the specifics, the specific policies, in identifying and selecting the foreign partners that will help fulfill these broad objectives that are provided by the foreign policy executive. Which then leads to how do they, so we know now when organizations have more leverage, but how do they actually advocate for particular partnerships? And that's where obviously we have the same logic that has been identified by Allison and Albrin, as that organizations strive for efficiency because they compete with other, domestic organizations or other maybe private partners. So obviously they want to attain in a very efficiently way their objectives. So they find organizations that can help them in other countries to attain these objectives in an efficient manner. Now, they also, what we notice is not just about efficiency objectives, they also, at least hypothesize that they also look to develop partnerships with international counterparts, other organizations that looks very similar in other countries in their institutional design and their internal organizational cultures. And that's where we identify these conditions that are present in some of the cases when in the 1950s, 60s for India's collaboration with France or India's collaboration with Israel in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Yeah, as Nicolas rightly pointed out, we identify 4 hypotheses where, and it's really a 2-stage process. So how does this play out in the cases that we examine? The cases are India-Israel and India-France. And so let me talk a little bit about the India-France case. Here we find that France and India, we now think that they have had a strategic partnership since the 90s, and they're both democracies. They don't have a colonial relationship like the UK and India. But this was far from settled, say, in the late 40s and 50s, because France had colonial possessions and the fate of them were far from settled. What implication does that have for our research puzzle is that the 2 ministries, the 2 foreign ministries in Paris and New Delhi were not speaking to each other in these early years of the Cold War, early years of India's independence. And this is a time where we find that the Atomic Energy Commissions, the CEOA on the French side and the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, formed the first nuclear cooperation agreement in 1951. And it's entirely led by the initiative of these 2 specialized sub-state organizations, once again specialized because we're talking about nuclear technologies. And so that's one example where we find that these are specialized domain where the foreign policy executive, the FPE, is entirely deferring to these sub-state actors. And the broad objectives, which is our second hypothesis, have been drawn, and that is find technological partners, find foreign technological partners to expand India's nuclear energy program, and whoever those partners would be, whoever would give technology transfer. And the French were doing exactly that. So this is an example where the SSOs, the sub-state organizations, are coming together, doing something that is not exactly contradictory to the broad foreign policy objectives under circumstances where the 2 foreign policy ministries, the FPEs in our research design, are not on speaking terms. And that leads to outcomes. That does lead to nuclear cooperation agreements between the 2, between the French and the Indian side. We see something quite similar in the case of space cooperation between India and France, once again, which is our main case study, other than our other main case study, India-Israel. We find that although NASA was the first technical partner of the Indian counterpart, we find that the CNES, which is the French version of NASA, the French version of NASA, actually begin and expand space cooperation with India. Once again, technology transfer. And technology transfer fit very well with respect to the broad foreign policy objectives of strategic autonomy, making sure that India's foreign policy and India's dependence on the outside world is as less as possible. So technology transfer is what we find that the Indian SSO, in this case, the Department of Atomic Energy, and then ISRO gets from the French counterpart. And this is once again the same time where there is really not much going on in foreign policy domain in the 60s and 70s between India and France. But when it comes to the efficiency seeking and the institutional cultures, we find that the ISRO and the CNES, the CEOA, and the Atomic Energy Commission of India, they're very similar. They're very similar in the way they're structured. They have a lot of independence and a lot of, they have the ability to function without much meddling by domestic politics. Certainly no control of the legislature, but directly under the control of the Prime Minister's office in the case of India. We find evidence that the similar institutional designs and institutional cultures had a direct impact on them, not just choosing each other, but the ability to function effectively together in the technological partnership. And I'll let my co-author Nicolas explain the India-Israel case.
Yeah, so thank you, Jayita. I mean, I'm going to briefly talk about the India-Israel case, because the India-Israel case actually in our article is maybe a little, the results are maybe a little less conclusive than in the India-France case. Because India-Israel, we're looking mostly about the defense partnerships and we hypothesize that the Defense Research and Development Organization, the DRDO, which is India's main agency working on trying to develop an indigenous defense industry, had some issues. It's that we hypothesize that would establish kind of relations with some of Israel's own state-owned or semi-private, semi-public defense industries. What we both discovered looking at this case is that there was some degree of collaboration of discussion after the two countries established diplomatic relations, because until 1992, India and Israel do not have diplomatic relations. India had problems with the concept of the creation of the State of Israel in the early 50s, then recognized Israel but never established diplomatic relations. So it's a very troubled relationship, and only in 1992 there's an establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Despite that, despite the establishment of bilateral ties, there's barely any political relationship. So you see the early discussions between these standard substate organizations in the Indian case, in the Israeli case. There's little discussion maybe until the Kargil War, which is a war in 1999 between India and Pakistan. And then there's this kind of structural opportunity for India's defense organizations to start talking to the Israeli ones, because there's increasing deference of the foreign policy executive, whether it's the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Defense Ministry, to these organizations because of defense preparedness after the conflict with Pakistan in high-level terrain in Kashmir. So there's also an effort from this substate organization to fit India's security requirements and the very broad definition of what strategic autonomy is, with identifying Israel as actually directly helping with fulfilling these particular requirements, these broad requirements defined by the foreign policy executive. So what you see is that you see the conditions happening in the late 90s, early 2000s for a broader engagement with Israel, and then the India's Defense Research and Development Organization, the DRDO, argues that Israeli defense industries are the right partner for high technology cooperation in niche fields, what is surface-to-air missiles, the drone technology, you name it. There's a lot of different fields they started talking about. And they also, one thing that helped the RDO is that they initially was reluctant to cooperate with Israel because they thought they were competitors. These defense organizations would be competitors to the RDO, but they increasingly found that they had similar maybe kind of internal structures. We were talking again about the institutional design of these organizations, there is some similarities, some structural similarities between the RDO and Israeli airspace industries, which were created both around the same time in the 1950s to develop strong indigenous defense productions in both countries, and also had been victims, both have had their basically prerogative expanded because both India and Israel have been direct targets of embargoes in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So again, both of these organizations had to work in isolation, and that these kind of structural objectives and challenges are something that brought maybe also these organizations together. So that explains why after 42 years of no diplomatic relations between India and Israel, suddenly there's a strong defense partnership. I don't think we can explain with the traditional paradigms of IR. We need to have a more complete explanation with this theory that we have about transnational partnerships between sub-state organizations.
So the implications of our research findings on policy is something that Nicolas and I have thought about quite a lot, and we have written some of that in the article. But there are new events coming up all the time. I think in one aspect that is an interest of mine, and that is U.S. foreign policy in South Asia, is something that I'm deeply interested in as a scholar. So when I look at the subcontinent as a region, and I look at its history and the patterns of U.S. foreign policy even today, I see that there is a lot to be said about the role of sub-state organizations as foreign policy agents when it comes to U.S.-Pakistan relations. And when I say that, I mean that every time we have seen throughout the Cold War till more recently, perhaps less so under the current administration, throughout the Cold War until more recently, whenever there have been tensions in U.S.-Pakistan relations, whether it's about cracking down on the extremists or not doing enough, which is a related issue on the war on terror, it seems that we are aware there is tension at the foreign policy level between Islamabad and Washington. But at the same time, when we look closer at the relationship, we have found that the relationship between the DoD, here in the United States, and the Pakistani military have often kept the relationship afloat. And from the past, I can think of, say, the LBJ era, the Johnson administration, when there was a lot of tension between Pakistan, because Pakistan was leaning towards China. A time when Pakistan also had CIA bases to fly over the Soviet Union to get more information about Soviet nuclear weapons development and missile trajectories, and also had very close relationship with the ISI. And that was also a time when the Pentagon was the most important and proactive advocate of Islamabad, which is not, at the time, Rawalpindi, which is not really checking most of the boxes of U.S. foreign policy priorities in the Cold War international system, but the sub-state actors, the sub-state organizations are really moving foreign policy forward. We have seen similar trends in even more recent times, certainly during the Obama administration. The current administration is less so, because it seems that there is a lot of discontent with Pakistan, and it's at multiple levels. But I think the U.S.-Pakistan dynamic and the patterns we see in U.S.-Pakistan relations, say since the alliance of '54, certainly demonstrate very appropriately and adequately the role of sub-state organizations.
Yeah.
Over to you, Nicolas.
Yeah, and adding to what Jayita just said, there's a couple of other. There's a lot of potential examples I could think of, but I think what we identified as a puzzle, right? When you have propitious maybe conditions, if you look at some of the grand fears for cooperation, but that's not sufficient conditions to explain why one country selects a partner or not, right? So it's completing a little bit the existing explanations. But we kind of think that our kind of approach about looking at the role of sub-state organizations in confirming, consolidating, or actually sometimes driving most of the relationships between two countries, it could actually also happen when there's actually direct opposition from the foreign policy executive. So when you see this kind of increasingly globalized networks today, when there's so many parallel communications going on, transactions happening at various layers of specialized expertise, that the foreign policy executive is going to have to defer more and more and might not be able to know what everything that's happening at the same time, right? So you could see sometimes that going against the national interest. One case, again, we're building on India, is recently last week sort of escaping a little bit from the craziness that's happening in Washington, D.C. Mike Pompeo and General Mattis were both in Delhi for the defense cooperation negotiations and the 2+2 meeting. The issue is that they also tried to push India to move back from an agreement with Russia of buying the S-400 surface-to-air missile system, and the Indians didn't back down. They're really keen on improving relations at the defense and strategic level with the U.S., but especially considering the problems they have in their own regions with other rivals, but they're not ready to give up on certain long-term defense relationships where there's been long-term cooperation between their sub-state organizations in them mutually. So again, they're not ready to. There's these parallel tracks happening, and they think these should be these should be separated, and there's these two levels of cooperation going on. And is that the pressure of the sub-state organization? That's an empirical question we would like to try to test and to address maybe in the coming years.